stand up here because I have a cold and I'm not sure my voice is going to carry from the table. So my name is Nicola Hughes and I work for a small NGO called Sustainable Northern Ireland. We're a charity and our main business is providing a support programme for local authorities, for the local government sector here in Northern Ireland, to help them to comply with their statutory requirements on sustainable development and help to guide councils to follow a similar path of sustainability. So I'm really going to talk about, because of my personal interest in the area of climate change, energy and waste, and also that's a big area where councils have possibly more influence over, and Emily's already spoken about biodiversity, so I won't cover that. But I want to first, it's difficult to put a positive spin on in this kind of a presentation, and it's very easy to kind of scaremonger, etc. But I want to reflect on some of the policy successes and the progress and how far we've come whilst being part of the EU, and reflect on the fact that we've come a long way in terms of coming further on sustainability by acting not alone as individual countries, but in terms of acting as a bloc. And some of the examples of this would be, there's been a substantial drop in industrial sources of air pollution and water pollution, particularly from farming. There's been big drops in greenhouse gas emissions, increases in energy efficiency and deployment of renewable energy. There's been a significant transformation in the way we manage waste, and only on Friday the Northern Ireland government released a press circular to celebrate the fact that Northern Ireland had received, or had now reached a 50% household recycling rate, which is the highest ever recycling rate ever in Northern Ireland. And we're taking the first steps towards a more circular economy approach to waste management, which is great. And a lot of that's been driven by the EU and the stringent taxes and targets around landfill and recycling, etc. The wide-scale adoption of common targets and timetables and regulations under various directives, and this has driven much innovation in terms of the renewable energy technology, and also in waste, how we treat waste. And you can't underestimate the amount of research and innovation that Northern Ireland specifically has benefited from in terms of receiving EU funding. Just recently, Northern Ireland Belfast Metropolitan College received the largest ever Interreg funding by an academic institution in Northern Ireland for a hydrogen project, which will look to pilot hydrogen as an energy storage medium and deploy it in both transformation and residential applications, which is really exciting. So there has been a lot of innovation. That said, so sorry to give a case study or an example, sort of from my point of view. A good example of the progress that has been made as being part of the EU would be if you look at the Republic of Ireland. Just 2 years ago, 2015, they brought in a Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Act, and there's been a massive amount of progress in terms of the Irish approach to climate change generally in just a couple of short years. I witnessed that firsthand. I was employed by the sort of Climate Change Advisory Council, so I was in the secretariat that was providing that Climate Change Advisory Council, and that all came about primarily because of EU targets around under the energy and climate package, and the sort of the mainly compliance driven in terms of the fines of not achieving ETS and non-ETS targets. So it is very compliance led. However, there's been massive progress in terms of policy, so the formulation of the Act itself, but also governance arrangements. And it's been quite an experience 2 years ago, for the last 2 years working down in Dublin, and it was a really exciting time getting lots of new things set up. And then cut to 2017, I'm now working in Northern Ireland, and it's a very different policy landscape in terms of climate change, but I'm not going to go into that. But I recently went to an event in Dublin, and it was the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, were holding a climate change research coordination meeting, and in that meeting there were research funders, relevant departments were there, and research users like myself, and research institutions, And it was just really interesting to see that the Department for Agriculture had a climate change policy unit that wasn't there previously. There was the Climate Change Advisory Council Secretariat people were there, and it was just a really good example of kind of good governance. And also I was really interested to find out that the equivalent of SOLAS, Northern Ireland, the County Council Managers Association, had sent their chair of their climate change committee, and that committee wasn't there a couple of years ago. That's a direct link to the Climate Change Act there. And yeah, it was just, I suppose I felt a little bit bewildered, and it really, for the first time, I noticed, the scale of the gap between what's happening in Northern Ireland and what's happening in the south. And I guess in terms of Brexit, I see that there is a gap already, and that gap is only going to widen in terms of the progress being made by other European member states and then ourselves, and it's a little bit worrying. So if I just go into how I see Brexit kind of impacting on the delivery of waste, energy and climate targets. Firstly on waste, I think that the amount of innovation and change that we've already seen, I think that the legacy and the momentum will continue. Landfills are costly, and I think landfill tax and regulation will probably be withheld. I hope that the ambitious circular economy 2030 package, that those targets will be mirrored in terms of the UK legislation. Because if there isn't, there will be potential issues around, if the UK doesn't have a similar model, then you can have a scenario where products being manufactured in the EU that aren't compliant with the circular economy package could be shipped to the UK and could be used there, and that's obviously going to inhibit progress in the rest of the EU, so that would be a problem. But I'm confident that the innovation to date and the economic opportunity that circular economy presents, coupled with the kind of financial burden of landfill and all the problems, environmental problems associated with it, will mean that councils, local government and national government will continue to look for more sustainable solutions around waste management. I'm not so confident on the climate and energy side of things, however. Yes, we have the UK Climate Change Act 2008, which has set a target around 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. I don't think these targets are not going to be affected. It's set in law. And it's also heartening to see that the UK government has recently adopted its fifth carbon budget and seems to be, through its clean growth strategy recently published, it's continuing in the direction of travel towards a more low carbon economy and climate resilient economy. However, it's the compliance issue that Viviane and Emily mentioned earlier. If we aren't part of the EU emission trading scheme and have these kind of financial sanctions associated with non-compliance, what's going to drive, how is the UK government going to be accountable to what they've set out and their various ambitions? There's also a possibility of reduced renewable subsidies and that decreasing investor confidence. In terms of energy, certainly the direction of travel of UK energy policy is towards energy security. Whether this is carbon intensive or cleaner, greener energy, it remains to be seen. There certainly is a fraction of the Conservative Party that is very much pro-fracking and nuclear and things like that. And I think a lot of it will depend on who's in government at the time, and whether they follow through on their climate commitments in terms of energy solutions for the future. But above all else, my main concern in terms of Northern Ireland continuing on a sustainable trajectory is what Emily was talking about around this kind of idea of race to the bottom in terms of the race for trade post-Brexit, compromising the environmental objectives to make way for economic growth above all else, and particularly around climate change, potentially scaling back climate change targets in terms of to make way for economic growth, particularly in the agri-food sector. This would be my main concern. agricultural sector makes up around a third of Northern Ireland's greenhouse gas emissions profile. And if you look at, the baseline isn't great to start off with before Brexit in terms of, our approach to agricultural policy versus climate change. There's a complete disconnect. You only have to look at the Growing for Growth strategy, which sets completely unsustainable targets for growth in poultry, beef and pig farming. We recently, a few months ago, there was we heard about a legal challenge to a new super pig farm in, I think it was Ballymoney. This is our government strategy anyway, before Brexit, and post-Brexit is only going to sort of add fuel to the fire, I think. And so that, to me, is a big threat to our climate change targets, coupled with the fact that Northern Ireland doesn't have any accountability really to speak of around climate change, and there are some weak targets in the programme for government. But in terms of my job, getting local authorities to act on climate change is very difficult without having our own legislation here in Northern Ireland and having local authorities be part of that legislation. In the south of Ireland, councils are required to produce climate change action plans. There's no such equivalent here, and it makes my job really difficult. However, final remarks would be try and put a sort of more of a positive spin. I think a lot rides on the political party in power post-Brexit, and whether Northern Ireland continues to have a devolved administration or not. The ability of NGOs and civil society to hold government to account, to retain environmental standards. I'm optimistic that kind of now proven economic benefits that a low-carbon, zero-waste economy presents, coupled with technology innovation and companies like Tesla and the way the market is going around cleaner forms of energy being cheaper as well, that will sort of bring us along in line with the rest of the EU and the rest of the world to hopefully a more sustainable future based on the economic argument alone, if it's the cheaper form of energy or if it's the cheaper way to deal with waste, then that will prevail. And Northern Ireland and the UK will have no choice but to fall in with the rest of the EU, or they will lose their competitive advantage in terms of industry, manufacturing and services. So I'm sceptical but also hopeful that there will be a silver lining. I'm happy to take questions. Yeah.